Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this episode of Teaching Palestine Today, and the topic is Western values. We are speaking today with Professor Ghassan Hage, who will address some of the commentaries we have had on what have we learned over the past year by a number of authors and scholars addressing the notion, admittedly the amorphous notion, but at some level quite concrete, of Western values. Ghassan, first of all, Kifak, how are you?
Alhamdulillah, thank you very much for Bassam. Lovely to see you again.
Very nice to see you again. Ghassan, you are actually part of the folks who responded to this question in the What Have We Learned series. But that's what we have been doing at some level, which is ask people who actually were involved to comment on the broader conversations. So before we feature these videos, do you have any comments you'd like to share about the topic? Just some quick comments before we start.
Well, I mean, obviously, given the scale of the genocide and its legitimization in the West, it's very hard today to even take seriously any conversation about Western values, to the extent that, I mean, I'd imagine someone from the outside looking at us at the moment and with a global vision and seeing what is happening in Gaza, and then listening to us trying to take seriously the notion that maybe we should even discuss Western value. So it's become a little bit tenuous. I feel hesitant to even engage in the discussion because I don't want people to laugh at me.
I hear you. I would like us to preview these conversations. It's 5 speakers, as I recall, and each speaks for about 5 minutes, and then we will give you the floor for feedback and reflection on the commentary before you can close with where do you think we're headed, especially in reference to how and whether these values will be restored and whether they can be restored. Good afternoon, Adam. How are you?
I'm doing well, Bassam. Thanks so much for having me.
So, Adam, you are one of the people who actually were responding, or who responded to the question about Western values in the series, What Have We Learned? You are the second guest to appear to address commentary on these questions. The first person was Ghassan Hage, and where he lives generally in Australia, and you live here in the United States. So we're trying to get a couple of perspectives, and I would like to ask you, before we even start, to share with me what is it, or how is it that, how are you doing, and what is it that may have changed since we recorded this material about a year ago?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And it was really sobering as I went back and started watching some of the clips and thinking about things that I said a year ago, that it's already been a year, and how much what we're going to be discussing today hasn't changed. I mean, you ask how I am. I mean, I would wonder the same thing about you, but how could any of us be 2 years after these last 2 years, 2 years into the genocide in Gaza? And I'm very interested to talk about this question of Western values given the last 2 years, because in some ways, some of my thoughts from a year ago are very much the same. Actually, nothing's changed, but now we've had a whole nother year of it, and the sort of hypocrisy and some of these lessons learned. So I'm just looking forward to talking about it.
I really look forward to speaking with you on this after you watch, or after we, sort of watch this live. Let's not delay. I'm going to go right to the videos and then we will take it from there.
Well, first of all, that they have to be in quotation marks. There's no such thing as Western values that are absolute, that are unchanging, and that are uncontested. What we see in the West, as we see everywhere else in the world, but in particular the West, is a huge struggle over the meaning of these so-called values. In other words, there are many, many young people who are extraordinarily supportive of Palestinian rights and Palestinian justice, and there are many people who are completely flippant and opposed to Palestinian justice and freedom. So that's what we see. There's no such thing as West or Western values. There is a constant contestation over the question of who defines what values are and who's included in the space of values.
Now, despite the murkiness and the constructed nature of this phrase or these terms, Western values, they do refer, at least by those who speak of Western values as representing them. There's this pretense of a distinction between Western values and the rest. Regarding that pretense, what happened to this pretense in the last 12 months or 11 months or so?
Well, two things have happened. One is that this pretense has been exposed as a pretense and as a cover for obscene and scandalous injustice, oppression, obliteration of humanity. We're talking about the destruction of schools, hospitals, tens of thousands of children, the introduction of polio epidemics. I mean, what's going on in Gaza is just an absolute and utter scandal. And anyone who says otherwise is on the wrong side of anything called human values, honestly. If that's what I would say. On the one hand, it's exposed the pretense of those who speak on behalf of Western values, and on the other hand, it also exposes the fact that those who speak about Western values and talk about human rights and talk about Western civilization as liberalism and as freedom and as democracy and all that stuff, do so by ignoring the fact that on the ground in Palestine, and this circles back to what we were saying earlier, on the ground in Palestine, there's proof of the opposite, that that what is going on is unconscionable. It is a complete negation of these professed values. And the reality is that in the West, there are many people, students of all faiths, professors, educators, lay people who are appalled by what is going on in Gaza. And these could be secular people, these could be atheists, these could be religious people, pious people, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, etc. And they're appalled. And that tells us that values ultimately are human values, or else they're not worth talking about as values. As soon as you start talking about Western values and separating them from Eastern values, or whatever you want to say, you start orientalizing and dividing up the world, you lose sight of what we should all be cherishing, which is universal values, irrespective of whether one is Western or Eastern or Northern or Southern or whatever.
Well, obviously, the curtain has been pulled back on those arrogant assertions of some, basic good that exists in the West and doesn't exist in other places. I think one of the most important developments globally of this year of genocide has been that the West has been revealed for what it, in fact, really is. Every society is heterogeneous, right? Not everybody has the same values. But if we're talking about the dominant values of Western governments, Western elites, Western corporations, the Western media, I said, you have to admit that settler colonialism, white supremacy, militarism, these are Western values. These are not that they don't exist in other places, but they are very clearly Western values, as is the idea of exceptionalism. That's a hallmark of Western history. On the one hand, you pronounce these ideals, and on the other hand, you violate them with impunity every opportunity that you have. That the benefits of human rights are for us, and the violation of human rights are for others. Israel has been held out as a Western exception that is not accountable to the Genocide Convention, to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to the international human rights treaties, to common decency, even. And so that reveals the hypocrisy of the assertion of so-called Western values. I think you could also say that Orientalism has been a constant Western value for centuries, beginning in Europe and then spreading into the US, newer countries as well. And we're seeing Orientalism in spades these days in the way that reporting and discussions around what's happening in the Middle East occur. I think it is absolutely undeniable that racism and Islamophobia have been central to Western values throughout all of their history. So I don't think we should be surprised that Israel, as a Western outpost, created by the West out of blood-soaked whole cloth, we shouldn't be surprised that it's built on an extreme form of these negative values of the West: militarism and racism and Islamophobia and exceptionalism, right? Whole states have been built around the idea of exceptionalism. The U.S. is one, Israel is another one. This is part of their founding myths, right? So these are the very negative, I think, values. And I think, you have to observe that discussions about values in the West are always tainted by a very large dose of hypocrisy. Human rights, democracy, the rule of law, these are all asserted by the West as a part of their values, but they've never been respected by the West vis-a-vis whoever is deemed to be the other, right? These are rights for us, but the other, no. I mean, you can ask the genocided indigenous people of the Americas, or the enslaved Africans in the US, or the victims of Jim Crow in the US, or even people living in poverty today in countries like the US. Or, ask all those people around the world who were massacred by the bombs and the bullets of Western armies, in China, in the Philippines, in Vietnam, in Western co-opted Middle Eastern states that have to put up with the Western-sponsored repression, and across Africa, Latin America, I mean, you name it. Or even ask the people who are trapped in the prison of poverty now by Western imperial exploitation, the imposition of these destructive neoliberal economics that are imposed on them by the West. Ask any of them whether human rights, democracy, and the rule of law are Western values, and I'm sure they will laugh in your face. I mean, the world is not fooled by this kind of rhetoric, and certainly after the genocide of 23 to 24, no Western power is going to be able to say those things with a straight face again, or at least be respected when they do. Now, I want to say also, Bassam, there's another West, and that's the people in civil society and social movements and labor unions on university campuses, all of whom are now and who have always stood up to oppose these negative values of the West, the wars of the West, the human rights violations of the West. And, I have to say, it's a pretty arrogant claim, if you think about it, for someone in the West to pretend that human rights are Western values. The West did not invent human rights, and they do not have a proud record of respecting them, least of all vis-a-vis all of the crimes that I've just mentioned of the West. But these other people in the West, those that are standing up to protest the genocide and apartheid in Palestine, Jews, Christians, Muslims, agnostics, everybody, who are facing harassment and assault and smears and being called awful names and being slandered and fired and suspended, being beaten and arrested by the police. I mean, they are a light in the West. Those are the values that we have to embrace. But if you ask them, and they're products of the West, they're the people of the West as well. But if you ask them whether they represent Western values, they will never say that they do. They'll be talking about universal values, right? The values of humanity. And they're just insisting that these values have to be applied universally. So Western values, I don't think it's anything to brag about, given what those values have looked like over the course of recent centuries and how they're exposed today during the genocide in Palestine. But there are people in the West who have decent values, universal values of things like human rights and equality, and who are standing up at personal risk to defend them. And I think that's good news.
So certainly it is the quotation marks are in place. For me, one of the things that we have learned is the close affinity and identification between liberalism and Zionism that long existed. Edward Said spoke about it and others as well. But I think this moment of genocide really brought to the fore, you know, that liberalism is not just enabling the settler colonial project. It's not just enabling the dispossession of Palestinians. We know always that the Zionist project has relied on aligning itself with liberalism and the liberal project and the West for legitimacy. I guess what we've learned in this moment is also that liberalism is what is enabling and sustaining this genocide. And this is happening in a time of a deep crisis for liberalism as a, as a political project. And we see the rise of fascism, which is as well connected to liberalism. And of course, it links also to the question of empire. But we are seeing liberalism play an indispensable role in allowing the genocide in Gaza. And, Palestine is, and Gaza now is a very telling moment about liberalism. And it's not only revealing the limits of the liberal project, and it's not only revealing its relationship to racism, imperialism, and colonialism. And it's not only testing the liberal international order or international law, but it also makes clear that the liberation of Palestine cannot take place in a world order organized by liberalism, given that liberalism is what sustains the subjugation and the colonization and the genocide of Palestinians. So it makes clear that, we need a different type of political imaginary, lexicon, and horizon. And I think that the Palestine activism that we are seeing globally is really pushing forward these conversations in an attempt to think about an alternative to the liberal project that really centers radical politics of liberation, of freedom, of anti-racism. And Palestine in this moment is really revealing much more than what is the question of Palestine and what can we learn about Palestine, but also what we can learn about the world, what we can learn about the West, what we can learn about world order. And Palestine is, bringing in this particular moment of the political crisis that we are in, really bringing to the fore a particular political vocabulary and horizon that we can develop further, because it's clear that liberalism is part of the problem. Liberalism is not where the hope is. That we have to move beyond liberalism, and we have to do that in significant and critical and radical ways, especially given the challenges of fascism that we are seeing. And Palestine is making this very, very, very clear, the limits of our current politics.
Again, I see sort of like here, I want to stick to those sort of like Western values, as in democracy, freedom of speech, common humanity, those values which are the values of the Western Enlightenment, and that people still believe that Western nations are embodying these values, and the fact that the current situations obviously shows how selective this adherence to Western values as they are defined here has become. The biggest thing that I have been really reflecting on has to do with this question of the place of the Arab other, which I touched on earlier when you asked me how I was, because it's such an enormous thing. You know, I have worked so much on racist othering, and how the different ways in which the West has othered people, and I stuck a bit too much between a duality between the other as an inferiorized other, and the other as an exploitable other. And so looking at Western colonialism as a history of inferiorizing and exploiting. One of the things that I haven't explored as much, and today I find myself increasingly in need of exploring, is the notion of the other as enemy and the degree of enmity that is being projected towards the Arab other. I think this mode of othering the other as enemy is not completely different, but sort of like highlights certain aspects of the undermining of Western value, which we do not get when we concentrate on the history of racism as inferiorization and the history of racism as a history of exploitation. Take in the way the West creates enemies, and you know, we are reaching out. I would say the degree to which genocide and the intensity of genocidal intent cannot be understood simply by inferiorization and exploitation, but precisely by trying to think, what does it mean to be an enemy other in such kind of like radical way?
Now, this one is one that I've been especially interested in too, because I'll have to say, before this last year, again at Mondoweiss, I don't think we had ever run a story about the West or talking about people's reactions to the West. But again, in terms of these ideas that have been delegitimized in this past year, if we've gained clarity in this last year around what Zionism means, we've also gained clarity around this last year about what the West means and what it signifies. And to take a slight step back for a second, I mean, we've seen this from the beginning of the year, and these people making these comparing the West's reaction to what's happening in Gaza versus the West's reaction to what's happening in Ukraine. And I personally, as an editor, I don't like this double standard kind of story, because it just honestly, it always just feels too obvious and just kind of like, well, of course there's a double standard. But one of the things that it led me to think is it's not a double standard. It is a single standard in terms of one of the things that we've learned about the West is that the West will use, promote, exercise, and forgive violence if done in the name of the West and in defense of the West, quote unquote, and its allies. And if you're in opposition to the West, then nearly anything is allowable. And that's one of the things that we have seen in terms of both Europe, the US, fully supporting the Israeli genocide in Gaza, including using the institutions of the West to help carry that out. Institutions like the UN, World Court, and ICJ, and one of the International Court of Justice. And one of the things that's been very interesting, and I think perhaps one of the reasons that the South African case at the ICJ was so interesting is that it is this example of the global South, for lack of a better word, using the West tools against it. And it still remains to be seen how that case will be resolved. We've seen that there's an effort at the ICC to bring war crimes charges against Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. Those have not yet been delivered. So even the fact that these institutions are starting to buckle under a year of genocide and a year of global pressure and have still not buckled, I think really kind of shows their role more than anything. That anything that we have thought of as the West in terms of like liberal democratic values is really window dressing and tools that they use however they want to enforce this policy of global domination. And if you stand in the way of it or if you oppose it, then you will be in the firing line next, which is what we're seeing right now with what started in Gaza spreading to Lebanon, perhaps Iran, and other parts of the region.
All right. Well, Ghassan, we have seen and heard a few comments taking different angles on the question of Western values, also in quotation marks. This is now your time to share with us some reflections on what we have watched and your own reflections a year after, which is essentially 2 years, almost 2 years after the basically the beginning of Israel's genocide, which did take place after the attacks of October 7th, which did take place after decades of dispossession and apartheid. So we are talking about a very complex history and somewhat of an amorphous topic today. But if anyone can pull this off, it'll be you. تفضل.
Thank you. Well, I mean, I think there are obviously some very important agreements over some important ways of thinking questions of values. First of all, it's quite interesting when we talk about Western values, and some people talk about Western values, but in the West, often people nationalize their Western values. They talk about American values or Australian values or French values. And usually they're quite trite, those values, in the sense that it's very hard not to agree that they are nice values, but it becomes very hard to think why have they been picked up as Western or national values. Like in Australia, sort of like they've got a thing about mateship being an Australian value in the sense of friendship. And you sit there wondering why and how did the Australians convince themselves that they are the only people who value friendship more than anything else, such as that becomes our Australian value. So there is an element of this in Western value, in the sense of values are always nice. Nobody likes to declare that they have bad values. And yes, so in a way, some people comment those values appear as sort of like appealing to anybody on top of the earth. Nobody is going to say we don't want democracy. Nobody wants to say we don't want freedom. So yes, but I think it would be good for an understanding of values to distinguish, first of all, between how they circulate first as a code of conduct and also as a fantasy and an aspiration. And so people sometimes say we have Western values, and they say we live by Western values. And another way of speaking of Western value is to say this is what we aspire for. And I think the speakers have highlighted that in both as code of conduct and as aspiration, values are a field of struggle. There are dominant people who appropriate within the institutions the claim to speak in the name of certain values, but there's always people who will challenge them. And so what we have today in the West is an interesting thing where the institution claims Western values but does not live by it as a code of conduct, while the people challenging them are the ones who try to live those values in their everyday practices, whether they are demonstrating in the streets, calling for ceasefire, etc. So in this, it is very important to distinguish something, I think. There's a lot of people who speak in the name of Western values who confuse them with white values. In fact, there's a lot of white supremacists who claim themselves to embody Western values. And here, you always come across something very interesting that is happening all the time throughout the Gaza genocide, which is a kind of essentialization of Western values as white values. But the idea is that, and this is really quite tricky, because the idea, they say, and you hear a lot of Zionists saying it as well, is that basically something like, sure, we are doing something really bad at the moment, but we are essentially good. It's true that we are not living by a value at the moment, but really these values are so much our essence that this not living by our value is just a conjuncture. Once we finish with the genocide, we'll return to being wonderful as we've always been. Interestingly, the other is always the reverse. That is, the other is essentially bad, even if sometimes they might fool you into thinking that they are good. But this is also conjunctural, their goodness, because they are essentially bad. So we have to be careful here, because if we are facing this essentialization at the level of discourse, just us saying that, the West is not living up to its value either as a code of conduct or as a fantasy. People say, yeah, but we are facing such an awful bad enemy, but once we finish the job, we'll return to being our wonderful selves. I think it is very important to stress the fact that there's no good self to return to. That the damage that has been done during this genocide is irreparable as far as the conception of the West as the holder of something that is universal, that we all need to aspire for. It's quite an important thing. I don't know how much it's possible to go through this here, but analytically we can say that Western values are no longer a code of conduct or even a fantasy today, but we use the term phallic. Phallic means it's something you flash. to say, I've got a really big one and you haven't got one. And so sort of like, I've got a lot of democracy, you're useless. I've got a lot of freedom of speech, look at you, you poor thing. Yours is, I can't see it anyway. It's quite interesting, this phallic logic, because Freud defined the phallus, and especially later, like as something that has no substance. And so in fact, the more you flash, I have democracy. It's like when the French during the Charlie Hebdo will say, I have a huge sense of humor. You don't have a sense of humor. Once you start using a phallic logic, you are in fact confirming that there is nothing there anymore. And that's where we are now.
Thanks, Ghassan. I would like to, before we move on to how might this be communicated in teaching about Palestine, mainly in the classroom, but any even public lecture at a church, synagogue, mosque, or anywhere. I would like to ask you about this question of coming back from. I recently wrote a short piece on Substack and I guess Twitter, X, titled "You Cannot Come Back from Genocide." And is this something which in that case applied to those who commit genocides, whether it's in Germany, Rwanda, or Palestine, Israel. So you shared as much that it's also not something that you could come back from. Can you say a little bit more on that, given the configuration of political economy, of political power, of military power, of financial power and dominance? Can, quote unquote, the countries that associate themselves with the notion West, because as we shared, the notion is amorphous,
Yes.
At the same time it's somewhat concrete. Can these countries come back from this moment and reassert the same values in any serious type of legitimacy, with any legitimacy?
Let me approach this from an anthropological point of view and say that anthropology has documented a long history of what is called warrior pollution. And this is an idea that you find in tribes in Africa, in Papua New Guinea, in Japan. It's the idea that when fighters fight in wars, even if they're fighting for us, we treat them as polluted, as having polluted themselves, and that before we let them re-enter the realm of the home, we have to engage in cleansing rituals. So, like, when Japanese samurai would fight, they are not allowed to their costume to enter the house. It has to be left outside of the house, has to be subjected to a cleansing ritual. I think it is something universal, almost, that war is polluting. War leaves a trace on you that is not easy to clean. You need to engage in all kinds of rituals or whatever we have in our modernity. And I just wonder how polluted and contaminated our societies have become through their complicity. And when I say our societies, I mean our Western societies, through their complicity in a way, they have all been participants in this war. And so I don't feel that this pollution is easy to clean, and that you can just take it out. It's a mode of contamination that is going to be contaminating our culture for a very long time. Australia, New Zealand, the US, I believe, all of them have a long history of killings, of colonial killings. And you can see circulating throughout these societies traces of these killings until now. Whether we're talking about indigenous killings or killing of American natives. So values are part of what are going to be polluted for a very long time. And I don't feel that there has been any readiness to engage in any cleansing rituals at the moment, or a capacity to do so.
And the asymmetry of power has a lot to do with the lack of an obligation to do that. I mean, there is a sense in which some who are in the seat of power believe that this is sufficient for them not to worry very much about that, because they determine and they define and they referee and they judge because they have the power to do all these things. Ghassan, can you just share with us any thoughts you have on communicating or transferring any knowledge, any critical knowledge about Western values to an audience, primarily in the classroom, but also a general audience? How would we approach this, given that the topic itself is a bit amorphous, and judging also from where you usually where you live, or you know, for the most part in Australia, when we say the West, I mean, Australia is considered part of the West, but geographically this is not a concrete category. Just like the Middle East, it's a conception. But how would you approach it?
Yes. Well, I mean, I think it is very crucial to educate people that there's a couple of things I will emphasize. First of all, in those countries, certainly in Australia, and I've seen it in US, etc., the capacity to be cosmopolitan, sort of like open-minded, democratically oriented, etc., is not a moral choice. Rather, it is the product of class conditions. I think one of the destructive things that have happened over the years is that middle classes that have a life that is remote from any forces of necessity, etc., can freely play on I'm so tolerant, I'm so, etc., and make it out as if what is really the product of their high cultural and economic capital is some kind of like internal virtue. And so I would, in any class, try and highlight that our values are not the starting point. of how we act in the world. Values are themselves the product of, and interact at least, with the social conditions in which we live. And show to what extent values are fluid and change how people who are inclined towards inclusion can become capable of extermination in rather extraordinarily quick fashion. I would emphasize all of that as a starting point, so that people don't start believing that it's enough to have some kind of like value to act well in the world.
Thank you so much, Ghassan. I honestly appreciate your contributions to this entire series, Gaza in Context, from the beginning. And I appreciate greatly the angle you shared towards the end, which is that values are a function of a number of things, of course, but perhaps chief among them the social conditions, which is part of the material sort of conditions in society, because people often dissociate the two, either analytically dissociate them, period, or out of concern that this sounds like a Marxist-based superstructure formula, which is essentially something that one can actually assert in this case.
I did think I was doing that as I was saying that.
I'm bringing it to the open. No, I absolutely see that, and this is actually not just in the realm of values, but also in the realm of law, considering the apex of what the law protects in many countries that are capitalist or post-capitalist, which is private property and so on. This is essentially a very productive framework that is very, very difficult to debunk empirically or analytically in terms of the importance of where things come from, not what they are in and of themselves. Otherwise, we're essentializing, and that's precisely the point of this entire conversation. Shukran, Ghassan, and I hope that we get a chance to speak with you in the future, but maybe not on these maybe perhaps hopefully on other topics, because what's going on right now is literally unfathomable, what continues to go on in Gaza. Hopefully we'll see you soon.
It's just another. Yes, I want to say, I want to tell you just now that I was giving this keynote at a conference at AUB that's happening now, and it's joint with BSZ University, and the whole contingent of people have come from BSZ, and they were clapped and welcomed like heroes at the conference. And I felt really good, because this, even though it's not much, but that coming from Australia, it was a wonderful thing to be in public or setting and people getting up and clapping Palestinians rather than having to worry about even pronouncing their name. So
absolutely. No, I've witnessed this image as well, and I hope that kind of sentiment actually gets transferred to more material things in the future. And we'll continue this series. We'll also be in touch with you about many other things. Shukran, Ghassan. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, all the best. All. Bye.
Salam.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And that, watching those, that was an incredibly rich conversation. And I'm happy to talk about whatever you'd like to talk about. I'm not necessarily going to comment on everything. Although, as you're watching it, it's also clear that there are a lot of common themes and around the hypocrisy and what has been delegitimized in these last 2 years. And so, just to say, including my own thoughts from a year ago, these are all things that I still think and agree with. As I was watching it, though, the part that the speaker who I was sort of most interested in and most engaged in, partly because it's also a little bit where my thinking is nowadays, is Lana Tatour, and where she was talking about both how the connection between Zionism and liberalism, but really this question of, so this whole idea of the West, this whole idea of Western values, this whole idea of liberalism and liberal values have been really delegitimized through watching them facilitate the genocide in Palestine. But then the question does become, so what does come next? What is built? And again, it's the comment that Craig Mokhiber and others made too, that the people who are going to build what comes next, who build the alternative, is civil society, are the people themselves. But as the entire sort of global system, at least as far as Western values and the rules-based order, whatever you want to call it, has been delegitimized, the task then becomes imagining and then building what comes next. And I think that's a question that I am incredibly interested in. Of course, the genocide is still ongoing. The genocide needs to end. There are a million questions about what is happening in the future of Palestine. But in terms of our topic here today, and what the genocide has revealed about the reality of the West and Western values, I think this is one of these core questions for us moving forward. The lies have been revealed. What are we going to build in their place? I'm very curious about this.
Is there anything that happened between last year and this year? I'm assuming you and I had this conversation around last year, somewhere in the fall. Is there something that happened that caused you to react in a different way? Not regarding the basics. The basics are the same as you shared, right? But did the time period or the length of time make our observation of the gap between, professed values and reality, did this make it worse?
Yeah. I mean, I would say that what has happened in this last year, and gosh, whether it's the last month or up till this morning, I mean, the data that we could collect on this question has just been constant over this period. But I would just say that, the contradictions have only, grown even greater in this past year. And one of the things that is interesting, because I think one of the things that makes me slightly different than the other responders here, although I guess, I know Craig somewhat, he's not necessarily a traditional academic, but I'm a journalist. I work in journalism spaces. I work more in movement spaces, less in academic spaces. And one of the things that has been clear to me is this conversation, which could feel very academic, has really extended beyond academia. That this is a question, and these are contradictions and hypocrisies that are being noticed very widely. And one of the things that has changed, I would say, in this last year is because, a year ago when we had this conversation, rightfully, we were very focused on the genocide. We were very focused on these sort of hypocrisies as they apply to Palestine in this broader range of Western values, the Palestinian exception. One of the things that has changed in this year is that we've learned that Palestine was somewhat a canary in the coal mine here. And these contradictions and the hypocrisy around values are now being seen broadly across, and I'm in the US, across US society. So, just as an example, and this is bringing in a topic that is beyond the scope of what we would normally be talking about, but when Charlie Kirk was killed a couple of weeks ago at this point, and for those who don't know, here in the US, Charlie Kirk is a far right wing influencer, and he was assassinated at a speaking engagement. It very quickly became that this was, and then the Trump administration started cracking down on anybody who was criticizing Kirk or criticizing. There was basically, it really very quickly raised this question around freedom of speech. You weren't allowed to say anything critical about Charlie Kirk. People started getting fired from their jobs. There were comedians who were taken off the air from late night comedy shows, things like that. And commentators in the news here in the U.S. started just saying, "Well, this is the worst assault on free speech in the United States in the last 50 years." And then people were very quick to point out that, again, just a year ago, within this last year, there have been students who have been hauled off the street for speaking out for Palestine. There are students who have been put in immigration detention for op-eds that they've written. And these connections about how this maybe first was happening when it came to Palestine, when it came to Gaza, and set a precedent that are now being carried out across US society for anyone who wants to speak out against the government or the dominant order. So I would say one of the things that has changed is, like, nothing has changed about Western values from the conversation we had a year ago. Nothing has changed in the way that Palestine and the intense dehumanization of any of Palestinians and anyone associated with Palestine. But I would say one of the things that is changing is now that is extending far beyond Palestine, that really set a blueprint that we are now seeing that really puts this question of Western values into either further relief, but really only reinforces what we talked about a year ago.
So basically, the gap / hypocrisy that we were witnessing is now squarely domestic in the United States, even though
100%.
it's not the beginning of the gap, but it's quite stark. In other words, we've always been, and I would assume, to be fair, any sort of society / culture / state / ideology would have gaps, some gaps. But what we are witnessing right now is almost like it's almost like a contradiction. It's not just a gap between professed values and action. It's almost like the action is the opposite of the professed value, and this is what is actually striking. It's not that we have moved away from these values. It's that we're deliberating the exact opposite of these values in our actions and statements. And when I say we, I don't mean everyone, and I don't even mean everyone in the Republican Party, to be quite fair and honest.
Yeah.
I mean the powers that be that are actually making decisions, and sort of a good class / layer of institutions and human beings around that. Because we have seen public polls reflect a serious departure from a lot of this discourse in the past. I mean, disappointingly, in the past few months only, since about March or April, that's when you saw people come out from unlikely places to speak against what's going on, and this is when you saw the perhaps significant drop in the polls in terms of views of Israel in the United States, even among American jury. All right, before we talk about sort of the future a bit more explicitly, and you said you wanted to have a back and forth, and I'm fine with that.
Yeah.
Can you share with us, given your your experience, given that you've lived here most of your life in the United States, and given that you grow up sort of learning about these values, and a lot of us, I mean, all of us believe in most of these basic, freedoms, whether it's freedom of speech, academic freedom, and just the basics, and then of course the questions of human rights and so on. How do you communicate what we are observing? How do you communicate this gap, this distance between what's professed and our actions as a state? And not just since a lot of people focus too much on Trump. And
Mhm.
it's like the same fallacy of focusing too much on Netanyahu and jettisoning the actual structure and institutions that exist with or without Trump or Netanyahu, which is essentially something to to pay attention to, if not the actual problem. So, how would you communicate this to, like, if you're giving a talk at a church, at a synagogue, at a mosque, a community center, or in a classroom? What would be the approach to people who, are kind of also in shock right now, who didn't necessarily feel that way before the Gaza genocide?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I will say that in my experience, and I've already somewhat alluded to this, but it speaks to this question that over these last 2 years, I've had, I mean, both in sort of events that you're describing, but even just in personal conversations I've had with people, people are recognizing exactly what we're talking about, whether they have the language for it fully or not. So a lot of the conversations I've had that get to these topics are really me reflecting back to people what they themselves are identifying. For example, like, why is it that I can't say what I really think when it comes to Palestine? Or why is it if I say what I want to say around Palestine, I could get in trouble at work, or I can get in trouble at school, or I can, get punished for just for speaking up for human rights. Um, and so I have found that my role in these conversations are more connecting the dots. And it was one of the things that I thought that Craig Mokhiber did well in what he spoke about. But like, clearly, what we're talking about within Western values, or certainly within the United States, U.S. history, is not new. But one of the things that has happened over these last 2 years is that some of these contradictions have become so clear that people can't ignore them, and they've also been impacting people who have typically not been impacted by them in the past. Um, and so drawing these connections between the experience around, say, freedom of speech or freedom of assembly, why you can't even protest, why students who were just protesting on their campus were getting thrown out of school, were getting suspended, again, were getting rounded up by the government. Um, all of these examples raise really fundamental questions around this question of Western values. And I think now that so many people have witnessed this and experienced this in a different way, it gives a whole new opportunity to start this conversation, which again is no longer strictly an academic conversation, but one that people now feel that they've experienced themselves and been directly impacted by.
Um, Thanks, Adam. I'd like to, move now to what do you think will be the impact of this? I mean, I called it in a tweet of mine almost 2 years ago, which is still pinned on my on my X profile or Twitter profile. I called it a fall from illusory grace instead of a fall from grace, which would mean that, oh, we just discovered that there is a gap, but
Yeah,
a fall from the illusion of grace. And this was just 2 months and a half into the genocide, when the United States had blocked ceasefire at the UN twice.
yeah,
So going back to that, where might this lead? Is it the kind of thing where we're going to go back to business as usual in terms of the deployment of these values? I have a hard time believing that, but I also have a hard time believing that we just created, uh, another Horkheimer or Adorno or some sort of a critical thinker throughout the United States. The population over. I don't think we're going to either, um, you know, go back to business as usual, nor have a sort of a cultural revolution because of it, or political revolution. So where might we be going?
I mean, obviously, this is a place where I have more questions than answers. But I would say, in going to the tweet that you read, which I agree with, I feel like another way of putting that, and it's one of the ways that I've been thinking about it, is that I think we are living in a crisis of legitimacy right now. That the system of Western values that we've been describing have been exposed. The emperor has no clothes. And so then what fills that void? And honestly, I mean, this is a place where, again, I come here not as an academic, especially compared to many of the other people that have been part of this series, but this is the role for academia, as I see it, to help us answer this question, to help sort of guide um, this cultural revolution, if you will. I guess I'm more hopeful in that way, because I do think that people are looking for answers to this question and are going to need help in thinking through it. So again, from my position as a journalist, I see us as helping to provide a platform for people to think through this question. But I do think it's one that people are searching for. And one of the other parts, and this goes back a little bit, but again, it's just more of this kind of data collection. But as we're having this conversation, we're right in this moment where the UN General Assembly is meeting. It was just meeting last week, and this whole question of Palestinian statehood was coming to the fore. And you were really seeing the West as this bloc um, fracture slightly over this question, where the United States is still very much opposed to this. Obviously, Israel is very opposed to this, but you see the UK, you see France, you see Canada coming out for this idea of supporting Palestinian statehood. So, regardless of how cynical we might be around that question of what that even means, for this conversation, though, I do think it's one of these reflections of this fragmentation and this sort of shattering in this moment of crisis that the West is experiencing, because there's an understanding that there is this crisis of legitimacy. That you even see in a country like Italy that's run by the far right, but coming off of a countrywide general strike demanding action on Palestine, came out in support of supporting something like the Gaza flotilla. Again, regardless of what we would like to see ideally versus what these countries are actually doing, I do think the contradictions of this last 2 years is leading to a crisis on the West that governments, at the level of governments now, are being forced to respond to, even if it is in this very artificial artificial way. So I personally have no doubt that we are in this moment of a crisis of legitimacy on the West. But what fills that void, I think, is an open question. I'm a person of and connected to social movements. I think it is, I wish that we were in a place and organized to the place that we could help fill that void. I think we will. Academia is another place that will help fill this void. But I really think that this is the open question, one of the open questions, at least moving forward.
Uh, I'm gonna ask you one more terrible question, and these refer to things that are not easy to answer on the spot. And by the way, you're being too kind when you mentioned that you're not an academic and so on. But I think every single person who spoke would hear you, and they would kind of roll their eyes because they would love to hear from you. And I'm saying this sincerely, by the way. So it's not just a compliment. It's true. your your take and your analysis, I would say, is even more valuable at some level, because academics can be, sort of cocooned and so on sometimes. All right. So my question is, we're talking about this as if, the outrage is what's going on, but what's going on is not the outrage at the gap between professed values and actions. What's going on is actually a some sort of a subcultural, or in part a cultural move, um, to critique what can be considered liberal values or woke values and so on. I mean, this is where the powers that be, what they're actually doing. Luckily, or fortunately, I should say, over the past 6 months, we've seen that supporters of the MAGA movement, or many of them, have sort of scaled back or took pause or actually started critiquing where things are going. People who campaigned and voted and are now, pushing away from that. But what this leaves me with, and you're the perfect person to speak with about this, what this leaves me with is, what does this do to this, in my view, not artificial, but this idea that there is a conflict in the United States culturally slash politically between the right, the Republicans, and then the left, the Democrats, and people like you and me and many others who are critical of both, because we're critical of the structures that actually make up our political systems, in the sense that there is a problem that needs to be addressed, that's not just about who's the president and this or that policy, but a deeper problem, which has to do with the entire party system, the domination of two parties, and how they are connected to the same interests, increasingly so, and so on. So, where does this back and forth in terms of the cultural, conversation or conflict? Where does this leave people who don't believe in necessarily in either party? Is this something that, uh, that's worth talking about, that might actually lead to what we have been talking about, to some sort of, an unknown that is good, or are the structural impediments to any third rail or any third party in the United States, or third direction, um, too strong for it to be penetrated?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is a great question. And I think one of the things that is very interesting, and um, I think when the history of this moment is written, of course, this moment is not over and we won't know. But one of the things that you pointed out, which is true, and it's something I've been very interested in, is that, and again, I always reflect this through our work at Mondoweiss. And so I'm going to refer to that slightly, but it's also true. We are constantly obsessing around the way that Palestine is representative of this shift that's happening amongst liberals and progressives. There's the Democratic Party, and it's becoming this generational split that's happening within the party when it comes to Palestine, where at one point, and this has changed immensely over this last 2 years, where at one point it was just, the young people in the Democratic Party who supported Palestinians, and now it's overwhelmingly throughout the party. And it's really become this political litmus test that we've seen in places like New York City, where Zohran Mamdani has sort of rode this wave in part, where the traditional party heads thought his support for Palestine was going to hurt him, and it really ended up helping him. And so we've been following this story, and it's very interesting. But I think something that we didn't expect, which is also true, is that the same thing is happening on the right. And when we look back at this moment, we're going to see that both the left, broadly defined, and the right, broadly defined, were both in this moment of fracturing. And Palestine was at the central of both, and the genocide was central to both. And it gets exactly to the issue that we're talking about here, because in both places, and this is true on the right as well, that Israel has become sort of this signifier for the West. It is the West in that part of the world, and it was for such a long time through like Zionist talking points, and whether in Israel or in the U.S., we have shared values. That was a long-term part of this Hasbara propaganda to explain why the US and Israel supported each other so deeply. And so many people take that for granted. And now what we're seeing is those shared values are leading to genocide. And whether you're on the right or on your left, polling shows that people overwhelmingly understand that what we're seeing is genocide, overwhelmingly understand that Palestinians are being oppressed, and overwhelmingly understand that the US is central to that. And so again, where the scenario that you laid out really just leads to is, what is there to be done about this? I mean, I just think what it is, and I wouldn't say that, obviously the left and the right are the same, that they share the same values. They clearly don't. And there has been, this is a moment of opportunity to move beyond, say, some of our traditional allies and coalitions, to dig into, like, and pointing out again what some of these contradictions are, what some of these, I forget the term that you used, but sort of entrenched power structures are that are leading us to not only, support the colonization of Palestine there, but also being forced to quelch free speech here when it comes to talking about these systems of domination. These are observations that are happening across society, and I think there's an opportunity to have a conversation, and perhaps an opportunity to come to think of alternatives beyond a traditional left-right dichotomy. But this has not been just a conversation or a reality on the left. This is something else that has probably changed in the year since we last talked about this. But these contradictions and this hypocrisy is now getting widely recognized and talked about, I would say, across U.S. society, which is where I'm most familiar. But my guess would be, clearly around the world, but I would say around the West as well.
Just to avoid us being a subject of ridicule, if people are watching from, I don't know, places like Italy or Spain or even France, where there's a strike this week, among laborers, laborers who work in the train industry and so on. So when we say left and right in America, we mean left and right vis-a-vis what is left and right in the United States, or thought of as left and right. Whereas in reality, there's a right. I'm not going to say extreme right or far right. Let's say there's a right in the United States, and then there's a center and center right.
And a liberal right. Yeah. No, that's completely true.
Because and you know this when I mean, of course, there are the people on the left, but when we talk about Democrats and Republicans, and of course, there are the Democrats that are center left, I acknowledge and I know, but in general, it's a centrist party, or even center right,
100%
in economic senses. Now, the reason I say this is not because when people were saying Obama is a socialist from the right, it's not because Obama is not a socialist and Democrats would say no, he's not a socialist. It's not because I also don't think he's not a socialist. And of course, I mean, Jesus, of course he's not. If you look at the record, but it's how offended many Democrats are and how they say it. It's not that they reject it, which we all do. And you can have a far, quote unquote, far left Marxist who says that, but it's how offended many Democrats are when they say, no, he's not a socialist, right? Like, how dare do you accuse him of, rather than, no, he's not a socialist. You look at, his statements, his claims, his policies, and so on. So that's how you know that's the case. Same thing with Mamdani. I mean, they tried to go with by the way, it's not just opponents of Zohran Mamdani who mispronounce his name. And it's unfair to just call out people, quote unquote, who critique him. It's also people who support him. And if you listen to the various podcasts, and for some reason, Mamdani is a very powerful way of not powerful, but recurring way of saying his name. It's Mamdani with an N. Anyway, so even with Zohran Mamdani, the idea that, he's a socialist is enough, because they couldn't peddle this thing about terrorist or even Islamist, because not only is he secular, but he's also like not religious, and has a particular kind of history and background. He's not like, it's difficult to sell him being an Islamist or a terrorist. So they went for the socialist, and that should be enough, right? Or that's what they thought. So I just wanted to clarify that point, which also speaks to our topic of, Western values, and these include political values, which I am witnessing a change even in my classroom, right? Not now, not just after the genocide, but also for the past several years. In fact, the the watershed moment, if there is one, was after the crash of 2008, where people were no longer so scared or offended if you wanted to talk about the value of the free market. That's when people were like, I'm willing to listen, I'm willing to speak about it. I haven't changed my mind, but I'm more open than I ever was. And that's the model, or a model response, not necessarily everyone's response. So yeah, that was a long disclaimer. I'm sorry.
No, that was helpful. But yeah, it's that it's interesting to hear that that's when it became a question on the table. And I think, yeah, it's only intensified since then.
Yeah, I'm referring to, when I mean I'm referring to how I was observing less resistance to being open to talk about it, right? So that's what I'm referring to.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
of course, the question of per capita income in the United States, question of healthcare, the question of all these questions that have to do with distribution of wealth,
Yeah.
are making people who are otherwise, free market absolutists, think differently. Even some of those people, not, of course, not everyone. Now, is there anything you'd like to share before we break? I know that we actually stayed longer than I thought, but is there anything you'd like to share?
Um, I don't think so. I think I sort of covered everything that what I was thinking. As much as I love talking with you, I hope we don't have to return and talk about this in another year.
Yeah, I hope that we don't talk about this again, and that we call each other and talk about superficial things. All
Yeah.
right.
But
Thank you
thank you for
again.
having me.
Thank you, Adam, for always being there and sharing your views. I hope we continue to speak with you under better circumstances.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
Take care.